Wonderful. Okay. Welcome everyone to the California Water Data Consortium's June 17th, 2026 Data for Lunch, Filling the Gaps with Ungauged Streamflow Forecasting with Alex Truby of Upstream Tech. I'm Elisa Salonis-Centric, the Senior Communications and Outreach Manager at the consortium, and I'll be introducing our speaker and supporting today's discussions. We also have our Senior Program Manager, Sonia Milonova, on the call to help facilitate and moderate today's discussion and Q&A. While we're kind of waiting for more folks to log on and get settled, I'm going to go over some quick housekeeping and the agenda. Yes, this meeting is being recorded. It'll be sent out via email, posted to our website and YouTube. Questions are welcome throughout the event. Please add them to the chat box in Zoom, and my colleague Avery will be collecting those. And then, of course, please complete the post-event survey. That helps us plan for future events and offerings. Here's today's agenda. Alex's presentation will be about 30 minutes or so. Then we have a facilitated discussion with Sonia and Alex where we prepared a couple of questions ahead of time. And then additionally, Alex has graciously agreed to stay on Zoom for your questions and an informal discussion at around 1. Again, feel free to pop your questions into the Zoom chat throughout today's event, and Avery will be collecting those for our discussion at the end of the presentation. And for those less familiar with the consortium, we are an independent nonprofit created through a partnership between state agencies and non-state entities. And our mission is to catalyze innovative water management through advancement and use of open data, especially in the face of climate change. And we do this by bringing people and institutions together to share ideas, synthesize information, and design smarter ways to use and share data. Our work spans research, tool development, hosting webinars and panels like this one, shaping policy recommendations, and helping our community come together around a shared vision for open data and climate resilience. And of course, you're all here today because you know about our Data for Lunch series. It's just one of the ways that we fulfill our mission. If this is your first time attending, welcome. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the California Department of Water Resources, Stantec, Environmental Science Associates, and Metropolitan Water District of California for making this Data for Lunch series possible. If you or your organization are interested in sponsoring future Data for Lunch events, please reach out to me directly for more information. There's a link in the chat with our sponsorship flyer. All right, with all that in mind, I'm excited to welcome Alex Truby to our Data for Lunch today. Alex is a solutions engineer for HydroForecast at Upstream Tech, where she focuses on expanding access to advanced streamflow forecasting across the water, energy, and climate sectors. In California, her work spans hydropower producers, Bureau of Reclamation reservoir operations, and active engagement with state agencies, water data organizations, and research and policy groups, exploring how advanced forecasting tools can support key state water management initiatives. A thread running through that work is the question of platform efficiency, how a single forecasting system can simultaneously support water accounting, forecasting informed operations, and environmental compliance, reducing duplicative effort across stakeholder groups. Now I'm going to hand over the reins to Alex for her presentation. Thank you for sharing your work and research today, Alex.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Can you all see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, really excited to be here today, talk with you all about ungauged streamflow forecasting. This is a topic that has kind of bubbled to the surface with some of the conversations that I've been having with various groups, both in California and kind of the larger North American area. But really excited to kind of hear your feedback and questions today. If we don't cover any applications and you think of applications outside of what I speak to, please reach out. You know, we're always looking to find more ways to apply this use case. So with that, I will dive in. Just quickly, kind of to give an overview of the agenda of what we'll cover today. So going to start with just giving an overview of who is Upstream Tech, what do we do, our team. We're going to talk about California's gauge sheen, kind of the current status, lay of the land, where machine learning can fit into this picture at a more holistic level. And then, given that this is the California Data Initiative, kind of bringing it home with applications for California-specific initiatives. Although, this forecasting application can be really deployed anywhere around the world. So just a little bit about Upstream Tech. We're a pretty small group. We're about 35 people. We're a pretty interdisciplinary team. We've got folks with water resources, data science backgrounds like myself. We've got PhD hydrologists on the team, machine learning engineers, software developers, folks from the conservation space, really kind of building a group that is interested in approaching environmental problems through the lens of software and data science. We do kind of have two products that we're focused on. Our first product is Lens. It's remote sensing software used for tracking changes through the landscape and infrastructure, both quantitatively as well as qualitatively. And then today, kind of really focused on the Streamflow forecast product, HydroForecast. It's a probabilistic machine learning Streamflow forecast that can be applied at both gauged and ungauged locations. And we'll really be focused on the ungauged aspect of that today. So just want to highlight too, we are actively deployed throughout California as well as globally. We're working with about 45 partners on the hydro forecast side. I think we're for sure in 5 continents. I think we might even be in 6 now. So I don't know if there'll ever be a need for active operational streamflow management in Antarctica, but we're ready to go if that is the case. So throughout California, we're deployed throughout the Sierras and kind of the snow-fed watersheds all the way to the coast where it's a bit more flashy, atmospheric river driven, working with hydropower operators, water supply managers, really anyone who is interested in having more data to better manage their water resources. So I'm going to start this out here. I do have it to give a shout out to Lucy Andrews, who I think I saw on the call. A lot of this kind of framework that I'm going to reference here actually came from one of your papers. So thank you. This was a kind of a small world coincidence as I started chatting with Sonia here. But I do think that this research really gives a great overview of kind of the current gauge status for the telemetry network in California specifically. So if you haven't read this paper, it's really great. Reference down here at the bottom. Really takes a holistic look at kind of the current monitoring network throughout California. And as we're talking about supporting the telemetry network with ungauged forecasts, I figured this would be a good place to start to kind of set the scene. So one of the things that I really liked about this view is the breakout by watershed level. We are also kind of working at a watershed level as we're delineating watersheds to deploy our forecast. So this is kind of a framework that HydroForecast is already operating in. I also really like the slicing and dicing of different ways to look at this coverage. So I mentioned we work with hydropower operators. I was particularly kind of surprised at the lack of coverage around some of the key dams in the state. Similar for biodiverse watersheds, some of the key environments that really do need high monitoring coverage. Another area that I want to dive into specifically today is the coverage in minimally disturbed watersheds. So a lot of the really highly populated areas that are closer to cities, they have better infrastructure. Those are already the areas that tend to have a little bit better monitoring network. It's oftentimes remote areas that are harder to access, that don't have as good as telemetry gauge network coverage. And I'll kind of narrow the scope to those today. So given, the overall maybe lack of coverage, one question might come up that says, well, can't we just go and add more gauges? And you can theoretically, but there are some realistic bounds to how many gauges you can go and deploy. So when you're thinking about scaling this, USGS estimates that the capital cost to install a gauge is anywhere between $25,000 and $40,000. The annual operations and maintenance costs are not quite as high, but still in a very similar range. And so if you're thinking about scaling this to every single river reach, let alone California, in California, let alone the nation, that becomes quite cost prohibitive at scale. Going and installing physical gauges can also be a very slow process. You're working with multiple landowners. Is there even access to, physical access to the river reach that you're wanting to install telemetry on? Working across multiple stakeholder groups who might have competing interests and different thoughts on where the best place to install a measurement device is along a river, and also with government. So we work oftentimes with plenty of state and federal agencies and love them to death, but they're not always the fastest moving entities. And so this whole process, installing a handful of gauges can take time. Installing an entire network will take a lot of time. And then also just the required travel to remote areas. So I mentioned that the areas that really don't have a high gauge density are really far away from populated centers. They require a lot of travel. You're sending one or two people out to these remote areas if there's access to the river at all, which can be dangerous, especially during certain times of year. But, it's possible. So this paper looked at just kind of limiting the scope to 500 gauges. That would get you a 61% increase in the number of kind of active monitoring networks around the state, which is definitely a significant jump. And there's associated costs with that, not only on the dollar side, if you kind of sum up the individual gauge costs to that 500 telemetry count, but also, how many field visits are you going out to the field? How many negotiations with landowners and various stakeholders? That's definitely going to be a very resource intensive process, not only on the dollar side, but also on the time side. You are increasing coverage significantly with that gauge count. On the dam side, you're jumping from about 9% coverage to a quarter coverage, which is a significant gain, but you're still nowhere near 100%. And similar story on the biodiverse watersheds, kind of looking at some of these key environmental habitats throughout the state. So definitely, we can go and install more gauges, and I don't think anyone would argue that we shouldn't do that, but there are kind of hurdles to get over to make that a reality. So I mentioned we'll kind of narrow the scope today to just look at the minimally disturbed watersheds for a few reasons. One is a modeling reason that I'll get into a little bit later. A second is because it kind of puts a boundary box on just what to look at. So this research found that after about 200 gauges in these minimally disturbed watersheds, you really start to kind of level off in terms of the gains. And so that's kind of puts a pretty good gauge count on what to work with. That's still a pretty significant cost, not only on the dollar side, but also, 200 gauges is a lot of landowners to negotiate with. It's a lot of travel time and access that you're needed to install. So this really got us thinking, is there an alternative option aside from going out and installing physical measurement devices for these minimally disturbed watersheds? And this is really I'm going to pivot to the current state to where machine learning can kind of fit into this picture at a little bit more of a holistic level. Before I go too far, I really just have to start by saying that the telemetry networks currently in place are foundational for any modeling on the machine learning side. So machine learning models are not possible without training data sets, and publicly available gauge on the foundation for any of the machine learning models that are built not only for streamflow, but for all sorts of river systems and applications. So it's these gauge networks that really set the foundation for machine learning models and their ability to make predictions and supplement this network in the first place. So how can we use machine learning models not to replace the telemetry network? I would say I don't think anyone would argue that we should go and replace actual measurement devices with estimates, but how can we use machine learning to support the current network of gauges? And so the biggest differentiation that I want to make here is that telemetry, a measurement device, will give you an actual measurement that can be critical for maintaining certain environmental flow thresholds. If there is a kind of an endangered species that needs very kind of minute tracking of streamflow, the telemetry device and getting an actual measurement is always going to be your best bet. I'm going to interchange machine learning ungauged forecasts as well as virtual gauges here. Those will both be a best estimate. So I'll probably use both interchangeably. We think most of the time in forecasting, so I'll probably talk about ungauged forecasts a little bit more than virtual gauges. A virtual gauge is essentially an instantaneous estimate for kind of like a gauge you would get one data point per timestamp, and then a forecast. Our forecast actually can go 10 days into the future with hourly time steps. And so you get a little bit more of a forward-looking predictability aspect to that ungauged location as well. So with those two kind of big asterisks there in place, you're comparing an actual measurement to a best estimate. There are also some other differences. I've already highlighted the cost aspect. One thing that is, I think, important to highlight again on that front is that for telemetry installations, you're really scaling in a linear way. You're not getting a ton of gains in terms of a device by device cost reduction. and going out and installing these gauges in these more remote locations also has an increased cost with the actual installation process, as well as going out to location once a year for operations and maintenance checks. Whereas on the machine learning and virtual forecast side, the scalability is really great. So the way that our forecasts work is that we'll delineate a watershed based on kind of the furthest, most downstream water point and delineate the entire watershed, and then adding virtual forecast points within that watershed is really quite cost effective. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. That scaling process and delineating a watershed to getting these forecasts up and running, we aim for about a 3-month timeline, and sometimes that can be reduced even further. So you can scale that really quickly, much more quickly than going and installing gauges across even an entire watershed, let alone the entire state. And you're removing that aspect of the travel to remote areas. With machine learning, there's obviously no humans out in the field. You might want to go out and maybe get an occasional measurement just to get a feel for if there's any bias in the models or how they're comparing to these spot checks. But ultimately, you're essentially negating the human travel to the field. So, that sounds great in theory. Let's talk a little bit about how this all works. So machine learning models, just to highlight here, have been applied in hydrology in the literature for about 30 years. Our team had some fun kind of looking back and seeing when we could first find these applications, and found a paper as early as 1995, which is pretty mind-boggling. That's 30 years ago that these have been applied for hydrology. And when you're talking about machine learning applications for hydrology, one model type will tend to kind of bubble up to the surface. It's an LSTM, long short-term memory network. And that's totally fine. If you don't know anything about LSTMs, really, there's only 2 takeaways to remember from today. It's a type of neural network model. It is particularly well suited for capturing nonlinear relationships. And so anyone working in hydrology or water resources knows very well that unfortunately, hydrologic systems don't always fit as nicely into the sets of equations that we all learned in school as we would like them to. And so they're really nonlinear, they're complex, especially in a snow-dominated system where there's rain on snow compounding effects. When you're talking about surface water, groundwater interaction, there are all these very complex dynamics that are really hard to capture in a linear manner. It's also a long short-term memory network, and so it is retaining memory throughout time. This is really helpful, again, in snow-dominated watersheds where what were recent conditions in the basin over the last few months? What precipitation and temperature regimes were happening? Was precipitation accumulating as snow, or was this falling as rain? Have there not been any precipitation? Was the ground really dry? These are all kind of factors that impact snow melt and runoff timing. And the model's retaining that information as it's making predictions about stream flow. This spring, it's retaining information, as early as last fall. So LSTMs, this paper is from 2019. Our CTO, Alden Keith Sampson, was a co-author on it. And it looked at comparing the LSTM models in hydrology to some of the physics-based conceptual models that are out there, such as National Water Model and SAC-SMA. This paper also looked at LSTM applications in an ungauged basin, which is that purple line there. The pub LSTM is the ungauged. So key takeaways from this chart is that NSE values are more accurate as you move closer to 1. Essentially, a perfect model has an NSE of 1. It means that the predictions are exactly in line with the observations for the hydrograph. And you can see that the LSTMs with all of the data with basin conditions are the most accurate, and that would be including a gauge assimilation. The ungauged LSTMs, taking into account just the meteorological forecast as well as the basin characteristics, are a very close second. And so this is kind of the research that opened up a lot of curiosity about the applications of ungauged forecasting for hydrology and how we can use machine learning to support that. So HydroForecast then essentially kind of took that foundational research, and our goal is to operationalize it. And we've been operationalizing LSTMs for hydrologic streamflow forecasting since, I think, 2018. So we've been doing this for a while and have had some time to iterate on this process. When you're thinking about the variables that we're feeding into our machine learning models, it's a lot of the same variables that you're feeding into a physics or conceptual based model. So we're pulling in multiple advanced weather forecasts. We're pulling in the ECMWF model from the European model. We're pulling in NOAA's GEFS, GFS, and HER, the high resolution models, feeding those into our forecasts. The high resolution model goes in every 2 hours, and then the other forecasts are updating every 6 to 12 hours. So that is a really driving function for streamflow forecast in the Ungauged Basin, is just that high frequency update of these meteorological forecasts kind of in combination with the basin characteristics. We're also then feeding in satellite data. So we'll pull in satellite daily observations, snow cover, snow water equivalent where they're applicable, as well as vegetation health. We will pull in land surface data sets. So land cover, land use, of course, the elevation profiles. And then if there are gauges in the basin, we will assimilate those as well every 2 hours. So that could be the USGS public gauge network, that might be private gauge networks. Even if we're deploying an ungauged forecast point at a certain location, if there are gauges in that basin, we can still assimilate that data with that high level of frequency to inform predictions at an ungauged spot. So you will notice in that process, most of those variables are natural systems. So this process is really kind of optimized for natural systems or those minimally disturbed watersheds. We can pick up some regulation in these forecasts if it's seasonally driven or if it's really driven by some of these meteorological or hydrological conditions. The model tends to run into some limitations if decisions are being made around like immediate power price decisions. That's a different type of model. It's not really a hydrology problem anymore. It's more of a human, social, economic problem, which can certainly be modeled, but is not what we're focused on. So part of the reason why we're kind of limiting the scope today to talk about these minimally disturbed watersheds. And kind of continuing on to the model training process and what really lays the foundation for this ability to deploy an ungauged forecast or a virtual gauge in these unmonitored watersheds. This is really key to that. So when I talk to a lot of people who are excited about machine learning applications in hydrology, a lot of times the gut reaction is, I'm going to go build a machine learning model, this cutting edge LSTM model for my specific basin. And that can yield really strong results, but you are also now at risk of overfitting to the historical data set in that basin. So what we've done with HydroForecast is that we've kind of trained the model in a very wide way. We trained the model in over 500 basins. Again, shout out to the USGS, all using very high fidelity USGS gauge data in these watersheds. And that the model, because it's seen so many data sets over so many different systems and basins and hydrologic conditions, and it's been exposed to all of these different storm events and extreme conditions, the model really starts to not overfit to a specific basin, but starts to learn as much as a machine learning model can learn the hydrologic processes that are governing the streamflow dynamics. And so it can take its learnings of these relationships and apply them to a specific watershed. So as we're seeing more variability in storm systems or more extreme events that are not inside the historical record for a specific area, the model can say, okay, I've actually seen something like this in my training data set. Let me take what I've learned there and apply it to the basin conditions at this location. So in that way, it's designed to predict these extreme events, not be foreseen in a watershed, which definitely helps to translate to the ungauged forecasting capabilities. The model is also designed to be robust to missing inputs. So we can't control if ECMWS forecasts are delayed a few hours. Similar story with NOAA. That certainly does happen. And because we're working in an operational context, our partners are pretty reliant on us to make our forecasts available on the same schedule every day. And if we're a little bit late, we also get calls from our partners asking where our forecasts are. So we've designed the models to be robust to missing inputs, whether that's a weather forecast or whether that's data assimilation from a gauge, which again kind of builds the foundation for the ability to deploy gauges at ungauged locations or deploy forecasts at ungauged locations. So that's phase one. Phase two is really dependent on if there are any gauges in the basin. If it's a completely ungauged basin, there's absolutely no data available. Predictions will be coming from that lumped model, which still does pretty well. And then if there are any gauges available, even if it's not the location that we're primarily interested in, we will still delineate the basin into smaller watersheds and then kind of route travel time using any gauge of information that's available in the watershed as a whole. And then the output then is we're actually making stream flow predictions at any and all gauges within a basin, as well as kind of the primary forecast point, which may not have a gauge in this case. So that all sounds great in theory. I think if I were sitting in your shoes, is does this actually work in an operational context? So this was from a hydropower industry competition that was held back in 2020, 2021, which, 5 or 6 years ago now, I think everyone that submitted forecasts during this time, including ourselves, have been continuously improving on our forecasting methodologies. There hasn't been another competition since then, so we'll use this as our reference. This competition was essentially bringing various forecasting groups together. There were 19 locations throughout North America, and each group would submit forecasts for all of these 19 locations every single day for a year. And there was a 6 hourly time step with a 10-day look ahead time. And no one could really agree what accuracy meant. So it finally got distilled into this 5x5 matrix, looking at regional breakdowns as well as kind of flow category breakdowns. This was all evaluated by a third party RTI. And our forecast did pretty well. And they did pretty well in snow-driven regions as well as non-snow-driven regions, kind of thinking about the extremes or talking to the extreme applications. If you are working in California water in 2020 or 2021, you probably know very well that that was a very, very dry year, still feeling the repercussions from that. On the opposite side in Quebec, that was actually one of their wettest years on record, and they had some of the worst flooding in the history of their data there. And using the same model infrastructure and the same, essentially the same model framework, we were able to perform really well on both ends of those extremes using the same model, which is really great to see. And so this is not to say, our model's the best, great, we're done here, let's leave. This is really, I think, what opened up more dialogue and curiosity about kind of moving machine learning applications in hydrology and streamflow forecasting from the research domain to an operational framework and kind of starting to trust them a little bit more in terms of how I'm making my day-to-day decisions for my operations, for my reservoir management, for my water supply forecasting. So I mentioned that HydroForecast is already deployed throughout California. So we've got pretty expansive footprint throughout the Sierras, ranging from north to south in those snow-dominated watersheds. We've also got forecasts kind of in the flashier coastal areas that are, all of this is impacted by storm systems like atmospheric rivers, but in different ways. So we're primarily supporting reservoir operations, flood awareness, water supply planning, as well as just increased data availability for these watersheds. And there are really 3 tiers, I would say, in which we're deployed. So one is at gauge locations. We are very often co-located with a CNRC forecasts or B120 forecast or some other publicly available forecast. And I think the benefit there is to have the publicly available issued forecast as well as an independent methodology that machine learning versus physics based. They give you information when they agree, and they also give you information when they start to veer away from one another. There's just more uncertainty in the system. We're deployed at gauge locations that don't have any alternative forecast, and then we're also deployed at ungauged locations. So this is true both for our work in California as well as our work throughout North America and globally. So just kind of honing in again to the virtual gauges and ungauged forecast applications. So again, big asterisk here, this is always going to be a best estimate, and this is not an actual measurement. It will never be as accurate as a direct measurement, but for many applications and cases, some data is often better than no data at all. So this is really where having a broader data set, having a little bit more visibility into watershed dynamics and certain stream reaches can certainly inform key decision making. So one of the trade-offs there is that you're not getting a direct measurement, you're getting a best estimate, but they are very scalable. They can be deployed at any tributary in the state, gauged or ungauged. You may not want to deploy it in a really critical habitat that has really fine-tuned thresholds that need to be abided by, or probably don't want to deploy it right underneath a reservoir that's making releases based on power price swings on a sub-hourly basis. But for where you're looking at natural flow systems, especially, I think this is a really great application and a way to just increase the amount of information that you're getting. Now, I kind of want to bring this back. I know we've got a pretty global audience here, it sounds like, but did want to kind of bring it back to some California-specific applications, given the core audience, and kind of just starting off with general watershed awareness. So increasing the understanding of flood risk, especially at ungauged river reaches where there may be smaller communities there with less access to cell service that don't have a USGS gauge, just raising awareness, monitoring low flow conditions that may impact environmental flow. So it won't be an exact measurement, but it will give you an idea of when we're potentially meeting either really high or really low thresholds along some river reaches, as well as supplemental information for diversion decisions. So it's not to say we're going to, make these decisions based off of this ungauged forecast, but it can serve as an indicator for maybe when to start having discussions if there's a flood event coming down the road. I just want to maybe tell a quick story here, especially on kind of highlighting the understanding of flood risk for river reaches. This was a photo from Leavenworth, Washington. The whole state really got impacted by some pretty intense atmospheric rivers this past December. So similar to California, a lot of these storm systems were very warm this winter. There was a little bit of snowpack on the ground, but most of the precipitation from this particular storm system fell as rain rather than snow, even though it was December. I've got some friends that live in this community kind of near the river, and our entire team on the HydroForecast side was monitoring our flow forecasts throughout the state. So we were working with lots of operators in Washington. We're in constant communication with them because these storm systems were so expansive, and the expected flows were so high. And I was kind of looking through our system. This is a screenshot from our dashboard at an ungauged forecast location in Washington along the river that flows through Leavenworth. And I was watching these flows kind of increase day by day. Here you can see our probability distribution. It's a fully probabilistic forecast. So the upper bound, the upper confidence interval was reaching really, really extreme flows. That's saying that there's a possibility that we're going to reach this really high flow threshold. And so actually looking at these forecasts is kind of what triggered me to text some of my friends in this community and say, hey, it looks like flows are getting really high around you. Are you guys okay? And got a text back a few hours later. They did have some flooding. They were out getting community supplies, but this really kind of drove home for me the value of raising awareness in some of these communities. I mean, Leavenworth has great cell signal. It's a pretty touristy area, but if you were to take that same story and apply it to area where it's harder to reach, where there's not as great of resources, this for me really kind of showed the value in having that awareness on some of these harder to reach areas. Also wanted to give a highlight here, kind of again, highlighting the California specific initiatives. This is a PPIC report that came out in November of last year. So talking about priorities for California's water. I know the Data Consortium was involved in a lot of this work as well. So I have to give you all a shout out for pulling this together. It's a really great report. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. They identified 3 areas where new research and initiatives in water accounting could provide a lot of benefit. And so really highlighting the first one, tracking water availability and use, kind of in addition to monitoring groundwater recharge and protecting water for the environment. Again, I think tracking water availability and use, just getting an understanding of the available water. Specifically, this would be talking about surface water as kind of a primary component of that system, but ungauged forecasts are a way to kind of elevate the picture of what is happening at the watershed level throughout the state, even where you don't have actual gauge measurements. This report also highlighted that some of the drought periods kind of revealed some weaknesses in the forecasting system for runoff and volume, specifically in the snowmelt fed areas. And a lot of this is because snowmelt dynamics are just so hard to capture in a lot of models, especially as you're seeing warmer seasons, like we saw this winter, really variable warm storm systems coming through. Not as much snowpack is accumulating. It's falling as rain rather than snow. You're getting more rain on snow dynamics earlier in the season. Those are all really complex dynamics to capture. And I think, again, going back to the way that the model is trained and the way HydroForecast is changed is you're getting a lot more exposure to those types of systems, and the model's learning those dynamics in a way that is a lot harder when you're training on a specific watershed. So expanding that then to ungauged and gauge forecasts, supporting with near real-time information. These are operational forecasts. They're built for real-time system integration. They're very scalable, so delineating a watershed and deploying really as many forecast points as you would want in a watershed is about a 3-month timeframe. I mentioned data integration because these are built for operationalization. They're built with REST APIs in mind. They're built with modern infrastructure. These are kind of some of the discussion points that actually came up on the last Data for Lunch webinar a few weeks back. Just the need and priority for kind of systems integration and having the data infrastructure that allows for that. And then going to accessibility. And I think having the infrastructure in place is a really key foundation for making all this information accessible. So just highlighting, it's really not about one component of a system, it's about the system as a whole and how all of these different components interact together. Talking about kind of elevating awareness of water throughout the state. So the California Water Plan is a really great, initiative mandate really to find more water for California. Sit on the technical working group for the California Water Plan, along with some people from the data consortium. And one thing that's really stood out to me is the interdisciplinary group that they've pulled together for this initiative. It's not just water resource planners, it's folks from environmental backgrounds that are managing really key habitats for endangered species. It's folks from groundwater expertise and management and recharge systems, people who are focused on data infrastructure and kind of modernizing technologies. And I think one question that rises to my mind when thinking about this application is how can we, quote unquote, find more water for California just with improved data and improved data systems? So California snowpack is the state's largest reservoir, but it's becoming less reliable. We saw that with the warm winter this year. Reservoirs are doing pretty well right now, but we don't have the snowpack reserve that you would normally see in late spring. All of that water is really already melted. A lot of the reservoirs were filled with rain rather than snowmelt this year. So how can we use technology to help us capture more of the water that we do have in a more variable climate when that snowpack is becoming less reliable? So some of the strongest proposed solutions that are kind of coming out of the water plan and discussions around that, such as forecast-informed reservoir operations, forecast being a key component of that, pairing that with managed aquifer recharge and groundwater recharge, as well as just integrated water management systems. All of these solutions are very promising, but also really do require a good handle of data, a good handle of water supply, when potential flood thresholds are going to be met, the timing of those so that you can go and make diversion decisions around groundwater recharge or, how much water should I be saving in my reservoir versus releasing? Those are all very data intensive decisions that need to be made. Another kind of question that we're really excited to explore is where can we expand this telemetry footprint? How can we kind of going back to the partnership of telemetry laying the foundation for modeling, how can we kind of give back to the telemetry networks that have served as the foundation to make all of this possible? So we're going to actually be doing some of this work with some federal partnerships. Later this year, we're going to be kicking off some projects to look at, where are models underperforming? Are those basins ones that we maybe need a higher telemetry footprint in, a more dense telemetry network? Can we use these models to actually Q&A, QC some of these existing gauges? Can we use the model fidelity compared to the actual measurements and observations to schedule operations and maintenance for these gauges, especially ones that might be in more remote locations, instead of kind of assuming we need to do that every year? Can we really optimize that schedule based on limited resources, maybe at the federal level? How can we maximize what we have with the data available? So, where do we go with all of this? Really, the goal is to increase information with reduced resources. So, talked a little bit earlier about just looking at the 200 gauges and minimally disturbed watersheds. I think that's probably those minimally disturbed watersheds and natural systems are probably the right place to start, at least with these ungauged forecasts. That's not to say they can't be deployed in more regulated systems down the road, but I think for sure a good starting point. So virtual gauges can reduce that cost kind of on a per gauge level by 3 to 4 times, depending on the scale of how many gauges are being deployed in a watershed. So you're either significantly reducing cost or you're expanding the amount of information that you're able to gather with the same amount of resources. Talked a lot about limitations where you can place a gauge. A lot of key river reaches may or may not even have road access. So virtual gauge, on the other hand, is quick and easy to deploy. You're essentially building that model from your computer Again, I think you probably want some site visits occasionally, but they're definitely not necessary. Again, caveat, be wise about where you're installing a virtual gauge based on the amount of regulation in the system and what kind of systems you're managing. Susceptible to physical damage and outages. This is something that is quite unfortunate when you're having really high flow events or when these gauges and the observations coming from them are most critical to understand current river conditions, but they are also right when they're most susceptible to being wiped out. We saw some of this with Hurricane Helene, kind of in the southeast of the US. There was some critical infrastructure there operated by utilities. Their USGS gauges got completely wiped by the high flows in the river. And we kind of did a backcast to say, how would the model have done, having gauges to assimilate to up to a certain point and then no gauge observations. We saw that just continued data stream coming from the model, even without any gauge observations in place, that really would have reduced some of that kind of data blindness that utilities and emergency responders are trying to work with information during these really high stress events. It's really when your on the ground gauges are most susceptible to damage. So integration can be convoluted. We talked a little bit, integration came up and kind of data accessibility came up a little bit in the webinar a few weeks back on that panel. With an on-the-ground gauge, do you have cell service to transfer data? I've talked to people who are maintaining gauges who have to go out and kind of physically download that data, bring it back to a computer, upload it, make it accessible. So you're getting data in batches, which is for sure useful, but maybe not as much in an operational day-to-day context. With the virtual gauges and ungauged forecast, because these are built with machine learning models and modern data infrastructure, they're served via REST APIs. This is all built for systems integration. So we're integration both of the partners. We're sending and receiving information from these forecasts really by request via REST APIs and on schedules, depending how the systems are set up. So that designed app component is already in place. And then again, big asterisk to all of this, the actual measurement piece versus you're getting a best estimate. So question of the decade, it seems like, is AI the answer for streamflow forecasting and everything else these days? And we would say that AI and machine learning should be part of the answer, not the whole thing. It's just one component. Telemetry will be key and will continue to be key. Even if, we built a fully comprehensive machine learning model now without telemetry to continuously calibrate that, it would be really hard to say if that same machine learning model without any tuning very likely is not going to be representative 10 years down the road, maybe not even 5. So that telemetry component is still key. The data systems integration, both transferring data into the models to help the ungauged forecast as well as vice versa, disseminating this information, also a key component. I would say collaboration across all of these different groups, collaboration across reservoir operators, water supply management managers, data components, all of this comes together and needs to be integrated. Physical models will forever be important as well. So I mentioned we're very often co-located alongside the CNRFC, B120 kind of forecasts that are coming out at a lot of these locations. There's value in having both the physical model and the machine learning model. They're independent components that give you similar information, but that information may be different. And where it is different, there's also information in that difference. So really just wanted to highlight that, it's not just one or two of these components, it's really how they come together as a system and system integration that really kind of makes this possibility, not only for ungauged forecasting applications, but just for water management in California and kind of more holistically when you're looking outside of a watershed level scale. So with that, I think that's the end of my main presentation there. Feel free to ask any questions during the session, and my email's here if you want to reach out to me directly.
Thank you, Alex. We are going to move into the facilitated discussion portion of the agenda, where Sonia's prepared a few questions. Let me just share my screen really quick. Yep, and we've also been collecting your questions throughout the presentation, so please continue to drop any of those into the chat box so we can address them during the Q&A portion of the event. And the mic is yours, Sonia.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Elisa. Thank you, Alex. Really, really fascinating. Um, it's been so interesting to learn about this. And yeah, as Elisa said, I have a few questions I prepared, and I'm really excited to jump into some of the audience questions. We also had a couple of questions submitted when people registered, so I will weave those in as well. But I want to start with just, it seems, especially here in California, it seems like every agency has their own model. How do you become the trusted source of information in this environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And something we hear a lot is like forecast overwhelm. There's so many different options, especially for when we're co-located with an RFC forecast, which one should we be looking at? And I think our stance in the direction that we're really moving is that there is not one forecast, like one forecast to rule them all. It does not exist and should not exist. And so how can we utilize all of the forecast information? They all tell you something different, even if they're agreement. Machine learning models do have less interpretability than a physics-based model. So the physics-based models will continue to get that interpretability. Machine learning models might see a little bit more data in how they're trained. And so you're getting maybe a little bit improved predictions on some of the extreme spectrums. And where we're actually moving with the HydroForecast system, kind of with all of this in mind, is creating not we'll still be optimizing for our streamflow forecast. That's still kind of our primary component, but pulling in way more forecasts than we do right now. So we'll pull in the CNRFCs into our system currently and show that in our platform. But we're also evaluating, what other machine learning models are out there in deployment, what other operational forecasts are out there, what new technologies might be out there. Google Flood Hub is operationalizing kind of a forecast platform as well. Can we pull that in? And the goal is to really have these all running in parallel in our platform with constant evaluation happening, because there's not very likely not going to be one forecast that nails it across the board on every single horizon and every single event. But with the constant evaluation ongoing with all of these parallel forecasts running, can we say, you know what, we're going to surface forecast A because this is going to be the most accurate forecast for your basin right now under these conditions. And then as we start to see that performance drop off, we'll surface model B. And really the goal is to say, kind of in a more model agnostic way, what is the best information to surface to you to make the decisions that you're optimizing for? And that might be different if you are optimizing around high flows or low flows. Different models might perform with higher accuracy in a high flow regime versus a low flow regime. And so that's kind of the direction we're moving and thinking about. We're really excited to kind of have that paradigm shift for our platform and where we're going, because yeah, to your point, there's so many great forecasts out there. They're all valuable. How do we maximize the information that we're getting from all of them?
It seems like we need new AI agents to tell us which models to use in those different environments.
Yeah, I don't, we're
Great.
working, maybe not quite agents, but evaluation for sure. But agents would
Okay.
be great. Yeah.
Well, that kind of leads into my next question that you started talking about. But, you know, in an ideal world, what does this look like long term? I mean, you guys have, yeah, your model, you're talking about how it shouldn't be the only one, there should be many others, but who would operate these models? Like how do we make this data accessible? How do we make this data cost effective? What happens with cost as AI stops being subsidized so heavily? Just maybe you could elaborate a bit on what this looks like long term.
Yeah. So this is something that, we ask ourselves every day. And right now we're kind of working on an operator by operator basis. But I think ultimately our dream scenario would be to be co-located at every CNRFC forecast, to be, have a forecast made available at every USGS gauge. We're a bunch of nerds that care about the environment. That's like the dream. And we're opening up a cooperative research agreement with NOAA where they'll have more accessibility and more kind of insight into our forecasts and vice versa. It's kind of a starting point, I think, for that collaboration. And we're very excited about that. But I think ultimately the goal would be to make this accessible, outside of that operator by operator basis. As we're expanding our footprint, we're working with reclamation currently. How can we expand our footprint with and partnership with state and federal agencies to open up these forecasts, outside of a specific operator's reservoir? Can we work at a larger scale to make this more accessible for multiple use cases? And then to your point on kind of the AI subsidy aspect, the nice thing about this type of operational model is that it's it's energy intensive to train, but the running every day is really pretty minimal on the cost and energy side so you're not necessarily using the same resources to get these predictions every day as you are to do the foundational model training. So I think that's a key difference too to highlight when you're comparing this type of modeling to some of the models that are kind of highlighted every day nowadays with LLMs and generative AI. Those are much more resource and cost intensive than this type of machine learning model, just in the way that the infrastructure is set up and kind of what is actually being run on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, okay. That's helpful. My next question, I am actually going to tie in a few of the audience questions because it seemed like this was something that came up a few times. But I was going to ask, how many gauges do you really need to make sure your model's performing well? And can the model tell you, like, you need some real data here, you need some real gauges here? And that ties into some, people ask questions of how does this work when you only have 3 or 4 readings per month, or just a really data scarce region. Tahir mentioned Kashmir Valley, and Zoe asks, how do you know that your model is actually performing accurately if you have no gauges? So maybe just talking about, ungauged basins, how you train models there, and how many gauges do you really need to really check the accuracy of your model?
Yeah, those are great questions. So for the lumped model itself, it was trained in a way where it had some holdout data sets. So where you're gauging model accuracy, assuming that you don't have a gauge there, and then you can compare the ungauged forecast against the gauges in place. So that's really how we're gauging kind of that foundational research, is gauging the accuracy of the ungauged forecast. When you're talking about deploying that into a specific watershed, there's for sure more uncertainty around that because you don't have those secretly hidden gauges ready to surface to gauge the accuracy. And so I think that's something that we would want to work with local operators to understand. If it is a point measurement that you're going out to get, that will likely give you some indication on if the model has a high or a low bias, and you might be able to make some adjustments in that regard. In terms of looking at how many gauges you need to answer that question of, do we need more gauges in this area so that we can have enough of a high fidelity model to be representative? We're going to be doing some work with some federal partners to really answer that question. We're going to be setting up some kind of test systems to say, we're going to deploy a forecast at a gauge location, at an ungauged location where there are gauges upstream, and at a fully ungauged watershed, or rather treating a gauged watershed at those 3 levels of kind of operations. And so kind of setting up some research tests to get to that question is, how does this model perform in completely engaged? How does this model perform when we have all of the gauges available? And how does this model perform when we're ungauged at this location, but including some of the gauges within the watershed? So hopefully more to come on that over the next year or so. That's certainly something we're thinking about as well.
Okay. All right, I want to ask follow-up questions, but I'm going to move on. And my last question, which actually is ties into the question that was just recently asked here in the chat, but thinking about groundwater and groundwater surface water interaction, I guess any thinking about how to do this to better understand groundwater surface water interaction with machine learning, and then kind of a follow-up that was just asked by Matt. How or to what extent is groundwater surface water interaction incorporated into how streamflow is estimated? Is it a model outcome or an input?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the second part first, because that kind of will lead into the first part of that question. So in terms of how the model is capturing groundwater interaction now, we are not currently pulling in any groundwater measurements or accounting for groundwater directly. So the model does pick up on some of these dynamics, really based on travel time within a watershed. So where we're having really, really slow travel time through systems, the model can start to learn those dynamics. If there's maybe more groundwater seepage, it will learn that inherently, but it will not necessarily directly associate that with groundwater. It will rather kind of surface in the streamflow predictions in an indirect manner. And we know this because we do work directly with operators who have really high groundwater influence basins. And so we can account for that in the stream flow, but it's mostly anecdotal at this point. We can't say this volume of water is recharging the aquifer. So that is to say, HydroForecast right now is really primarily focused on surface water components. And then going to that integration aspect, I think that this is something that could be paired really well with a substantive groundwater model. That could be a physical groundwater model, or it could be another machine learning model. You could very likely kind of replicate this infrastructure that has been applied to surface water flows and apply something very similar to a groundwater aspect. And then kind of use those two models together. Maybe that's when you get the one model to rule them all, is like pulling in the surface water aspect, the groundwater aspect, all of these other evapotranspiration aspects, and kind of feeding them into a more holistic modeling infrastructure. But I think to that point, like having the systems integration, the easily accessible data with REST APIs, and that infrastructure is really key to making that a possibility.
And you don't think that exists quite yet for groundwater?
I have not seen it quite yet for groundwater, but I would love to be proven wrong on that. So if you've got that, share
it. Okay, well, thank you so much. I know that some of you have to jump off at 1 o'clock, but we're going to continue with an informal Q&A session. So please feel free to stick around, and thank you, Alex, for staying on longer. I'm going to start with a few questions we got during the presentation, and you guys have continued to put questions in, so I'm trying to keep up. But I want to start with two questions that are related from Kamyar and Gus, and they have to do with just watersheds and systems changing over time in response to natural factors and human activities, or following significant changes like wildfire. How well are these models performing, and how often do they need to be re-verified after significant changes in the watershed?
Yeah, that's a great question. For our gauge forecast, we do try and do an evaluation at least a year. And I think to part of the kind of direction that we're going will improve this process, because the goal is to constantly evaluate all of these models in real time, have a constant evaluation, at least for the very minimum, the streamflow forecast. So when you're starting to see, this would be more for gauge forecast, when you're starting to see variance in the gauge forecast, that is a good indicator that something has changed in the basin, whether that is a regulation change, where maybe people are diverting flows at a different pace or different volumes. That could be a wildfire in the basin. So we have been pulling in vegetation health into our basin, and I've actually seen kind of that drop off in basins where we've had a watershed or had a wildfire in the watershed in which we have an operationalized forecast. Saw in Washington this past summer, the wildfire had burned for a few months. An atmospheric river was the event that finally put out the wildfire, which was great because the fire finally got put out, but it was put out by this really intense storm system that came through and dumped a bunch of rain. And because the model had kind of been tracking that interaction over time with the vegetation health, it did adapt fairly well to that drastic change in the landscape. When you have an ungauged basin, I think that's when you are reliant on local knowledge to say, we know that this regulation has changed, or there's been a wildfire impact to this basin. Let's kind of go back and recalibrate this model accordingly. So I think that's when you're starting to get to the importance of that collaboration piece. And if you don't have anything to compare these ungauged forecasts to, you just inherently are relying on kind of community and operational knowledge to understand when they should be reviewed.
Okay. Interesting. And jumping around a little bit, one of the questions we got from someone when they registered was just pointing out that water is owned by living people who allocate it for public welfare, according to the California Constitution, Section 2 of Article X. Is the accounting of where this water is flowing public information? And maybe you could just tie that into kind of making the complexities of making all of this information and all of the data that you're generating public and open.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, right now, our forecasts are primarily from us to an operator. I think with our reclamation forecast, we're going to try and open those up to the public as part of that kind of pilot with them down the road. And I think for any partnership with a state or federal agency, really the goal would be to make those public forecasts. Those are, public, those would be public dollars being used for this forecasting technology. And so that should be a public benefit. So that's ultimately, one way to open up that data. When you're talking about how that data is used after that surface water estimate is in place, that's where kind of our platform would end. We wouldn't be tracking necessarily the diversions going to specific water owners, or if that water is being used for a data center or irrigation or industry. Like that is not something that we're surfacing in our platform right now, and I think would be more reliant on some of the state platforms in California, like Cal Waters, would be a good way to kind of monitor those use cases in a publicly available way.
Okay.
Sonia, can I jump in real quick?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just gonna offer if anyone wants to hop off mute or like ask their question directly, if you can raise your hand, that would be great because we have a lot of questions. Oh, Lucy, cool. Let me make you let me give you that ability. Cool. There you go.
Awesome. Alex, this was great. I'm so excited to hear about your work. So thank you for this time. I dropped this in the chat, but thought I might just read this out loud so that I also had the chance to give you a verbal high five. What do you think about the utility or the maturity for the sorts of machine learning methods that you presented here for water temperature as a parameter or and a target, not just flow? Are folks already sort of working on this, or do you think that there is sufficient data for training and validation, or is it a gap where we need monitoring infrastructure first to produce the data sets that would then allow for the modeling work to happen?
Yeah, thanks. Also have to give you a virtual high five back for all of the research that I used to kind of set up the framework for this. So thank you. Glad you could join today. For on the temperature front, this is something that we hear a lot of questions about. Streamflow is great, especially for people who are primarily working in environmental flows or managing environmental flow boundaries. Temperature is also a key consideration. And we have not done any operational work on this yet. So we had an influx of requests for this a few years ago and kind of did a research project on it and saw some really promising results, but have not carried through to operations yet. And so in terms of operationalizing, I think that's very feasible is kind of the point that we got to. Is this does seem like something that we can kind of take that next step and carry over into operations. And that's something that I think is still on our wish list or to-do list in terms of getting that on. I don't have a timeline for that right now, but it is on our radar. I do think it is something that is feasible today, given the infrastructure in place. And I think the next step then would be to ask similar questions on, is this telemetry network, enough for an operational temperature model to be valuable to us for the applications? I think maybe a little bit more uncertainty, or I would have some questions around how finite are the thresholds for temperature. It's not going to be as extreme as streamflow with like quantifying flood risk or something like that, whereas habitat and certain species do have just a more fine-tuned threshold and kind of flow regime that they're working with on the temperature side. So long story short, I think we've done a little bit of work on that. We would love to operationalize it. I think the gauge system right now is at least in place to start tests for that application.
All right, Zoe, you're next. You should be able to unmute now. I don't know if we can hear you.
Maybe while we're waiting, I'll say if other folks are interested in temperature, let me know, because the more tallies we have, the easier it is for us to devote resources to start on that. So definitely reach out.
We did get another question about temperature. I don't know if while Zoe looked like was unmuted, but we still couldn't hear you, but maybe try again in a minute. I don't know if Matt Bailey, I'm not sure if I'm saying your name correctly, apologies, but you also had a question about, looking at temperature for knowing if there's actual stream flow. I don't know if Matt's still here, but. Do you want to come off mute and ask that question?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah. The question that I put in the chat was, Streamflow isn't the only way to gain information about, or stream, sorry, a traditional stream gauge isn't the only way to get information about Streamflow, that you could use to tune your models. And temperature in particular can be really, really useful in settings where flow is ephemeral, for example. And the question that you're asking is whether there's water in the stream or not. So I was just wondering if that's something that you've been thinking about with the system. It's a heck of a lot cheaper to throw a little temperature gauge in a stream than it is to develop a stream gauge and do the rating table and all that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to ask that question and put that out there.
Yeah, that's a great question. To my knowledge, that is not something that we have discussed in terms of being able to supplement kind of the telemetry network using temperature as the primary data input from these maybe gauges aside from streamflow. I do think that's something that would definitely be interesting to explore, especially for those kind of seasonal streams that you mentioned. I would have to ask our engineering team if in the past streamflow temperature is something that we've experimented on for model input. So right now we're pulling in precipitation and surface temperatures. I do think pulling in streamflow would be additive, assuming it does improve model accuracy. And I think one benefit of the model infrastructure is the ability to quickly test different types of inputs. And so the model is set up in a way that we would be able to test that relatively easily to see if that has improved model performance.
Thank you.
Zoe, did you want to try coming off mute again?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you, Alex. That was really cool. I've learned a lot, and I don't know a whole lot about this subject, so I'm sure you probably answered this already, but when you were talking about how your team noticed machine learning as far back as 1995 in this kind of work, my question is, is HydroForecast as a product the first machine learning system for streamflow forecasting? Or how does this differ from other studies or other products out there?
Yeah, great question. I believe HydroForecast was one of the first, and maybe still today is one of the very few operationalized streamflow forecasting that's using machine learning. So there are many applications out there that are using machine learning in a research context for hydrologic applications. I would say on the operational side, we were one of the early adopters of that technology in 2018 was kind of the first time we worked with a partner for the operational framework. It's growing every day. There's a few other folks out there that do it. Google Flood Hub is kind of releasing an open source flood model. It's not as granular. It's a daily time step. It's not, fine tuned to a basin, but there are continuously expanding applications for machine learning models in kind of that operational framework to varying levels of granularity and accuracy, I would say. Is there a second part to that question that I feel like I'm missing? But
No, that was helpful. Thank you.
okay, yeah.
Okay, if no one's raising their hand, I can keep going through some the chat ones. I don't know if Camiar's still here, but if you'd like to come off mute, had a couple of questions like about can you use these models to backfill data gaps in historical records? I don't know if you had some other questions. If Camiar, you're still here, go ahead and
Yeah, this Camiar. Thank you, Alex and team. Great presentation. The question I had was, in addition to forecasting, can these machine learning models be used to backcast to fill data gaps for maybe particular analytical purposes? And then the other question, which is not directly related, is here the California Environmental Flows Framework has put together a very impressive set of data sets on multiple streams and rivers throughout California and their historical flow dynamics, and then trying to use that to imagine or even forecast how the functional flows could be redone in these streams. So many of these streams don't have gauges. So my question is, do you know if the environmental flows framework has used these machine learning tools to fill in their data gaps?
Yeah, we actually did some work in partnership with the TNC, Nature Conservancy in California, to do a backcast of every single river reach in California and trying to answer that question. And the results were essentially inconclusive. So in some instances, the daily streamflow models historical were more accurate, and in other cases they were not, compared to especially kind of the monthly cadence of the National Water Model and some of the historical data sets coming out of there. So say ambiguous on that, with some caveats on if we were to kind of revisit that study, that was looking at the entire state as a singular model. So modeling every single river reach at the state level. If I were to kind of redo that, I'd have some questions around what happens if we look at a smaller scale, if we just do watershed level modeling. Do we see kind of more clear signals for the application on the e-flows? But that data set, I think, will be becoming available. I think the consensus there was that, especially for environmental flows applications, where again the thresholds are really critical. Some really low flow streams, even where there may be ephemeral, maybe not the best application right now, but for many other applications they are. So I think a big caveat there would be the framework is really designed for kind of current and forward-looking applications, less so on these really critical kind of environmental historical data sets. But in terms of getting the model set up, I think was really kind of an exciting step forward for that application, because just being able to model historical flows at, having a model that can actually do every single river reach at the state scale was something that was pretty exciting. And I think more research to come in that direction.
Yeah, and this Kamyar, just to add your response to a previous question on how often you're actually updating your machine learning models, which is really impressive, because in a sense, you will then implicitly be incorporating climate change impacts in those various watersheds. And I think that's one of the things that, for instance, the environmental flows framework has based their information on historical data. Then the question is, how do you adjust for that going forward with climate change? And I think these virtual machine learning gauges will be part of that. Thank you.
Thank you. I noticed Stephen Ho, I don't know if you're still on, but had a comment also about using ML to rebuild historical pattern. But you're also, I don't know, not really a question, but some comments about using these models to tell us where, where to locate gauges, and also to tell us, keep an eye on the gauges and tell us when something's amiss. I don't know if you wanted to voice over your comment or question, Stephen.
Sure. Thanks for the lunch and data. Happy to learn more about you guys. So we're approaching this much more from an operational point of view, right? We would like to go back even way before the 1995 that you guys have done, for example. A lot of districts are ancient. We have basement and vault worth of flow measurement data of varying fidelity and handwriting too. We would like to, do for lack of a better word, a one-time ingestion of that to create a very high quality back creation using real old data. And so it's slightly different than what you guys are offering, which is current and future and more of an ongoing support. But there's a large value in rebuilding what we had, is one. And secondarily, if we're keeping an eye out on these gauging stations, we cannot be there all the time. Our hydrographers, contractors usually can take some days before they notice a problem, or if by the time it's flagged by the database, it would be maybe weeks out. So short off getting hit by a thunder and the station goes offline, you don't really see that issue right away. And, like you said, with 500 basins being trained and knowing how it behave, I would assume that it's able to pick up on, oh, hey, some kids are starting to build a dam in the river and it is slowly changing the characteristic, and you may want to send someone out to remeasure, things of that nature. So thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, that last point is some work that we're going to be kicking off here this year with some federal partners is that exact question. How, once we see model divergence from the gauges that we do have installed, is that an indicator to go out and do a gauge check on the ground? Both, for timing wise and just optimizing the resources with limited teams to get that field time. And then to the first point, we can do historical look back periods. As more of kind of a one-off reconstruction. So I'd say the main focus is, now into the future, but we have done some work around hindcasts as well as kind of longer term climate studies going out and far and above beyond our kind of annual 365-day seasonal forecast that we provide. So kind of on both ends of the spectrum, have the ability to take the same model infrastructure and apply to those applications, but not the core operational focus that we have, to your point. Yeah.
Looks like we have Nancy. Nancy, go ahead, you can unmute.
Oh, hi, thanks for your presentation. There's a lot of interest in atmospheric river capture right now, and before and after, and how to build structures to capture it and then send it downstream to various other places. Are you working now with NOAA to develop anything along those lines? And if so, what are the big challenges? Because it's being promoted as a possible, drought remedy. Thanks.
Yeah, so this is a great question. Definitely something that's very applicable to California. So we are not necessarily focused specifically on atmospheric rivers. Our meteorological forecasts will envelop and kind of assimilate the atmospheric river forecasts that are out there. So we are by proxy including and using this atmospheric river information as an input into our models. I think the key difference here is that we're not necessarily focused on precipitation that's going to be coming out of the atmospheric rivers. We're rather optimizing for the streamflow impacts, which does translate to inflow into reservoirs. And so when you're thinking about forecast-informed reservoir operations, which is kind of one of, it's been around for many years now, but I think as we're talking about trying to capture more water, has become, of even greater importance over the last few years. And so I think, our forecasts you're really optimizing for the actual stream flow going into the reservoirs rather than the amount of precipitation that's coming from the storm system, because you're kind of optimizing for the end goal and the end decisions that need to be made around water availability in general and the timing and magnitude of those flows. And so the hydropower operators and reservoir operators that we work with, we do work with Sonoma Water, who is part of the USA SPRO program. I'd say really all of the hydropower operators and reservoir operators that we work with would say that they are doing forecast-informed reservoir operations. They're utilizing the stream flow and inflow information to make decisions around releases. Oftentimes during these storm systems, we do collaborate with CNRFC at specific locations and kind of open up access of our forecasts and vice versa. We'll have, our operators call us and kind of ask questions around any variance between the CNRFC forecasts and our forecasts. That happened pretty extensively during the atmospheric rivers this past December that swept through California. So we're not doing research necessarily on atmospheric rivers specifically, but really optimizing for the impacts of the rivers to the reservoir operators. And then ultimately the question is, how can you use that information of inflows to better manage water for releases, both for water supply or for groundwater recharge or kind of whatever downstream use case you're optimizing for.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you so much for all of your great questions. I think we have a couple more in the chat. Not sure if folks are still around to come off mute. Maybe I could ask Ashken and anyone else who'd like to raise your hand and ask a question. It's your last chance. Ashken, are you still with us?
I don't think they are.
Okay.
Hey, can you hear me?
Oh, go ahead, Jackson. Oh no, who's
Oh,
talking?
it was me,
Go
Ashton.
ahead. Go ahead,
There you are.
Ashken. Sorry.
Yeah, hey. Yeah,
Jackson, you're
thank you
next.
for your interesting presentation. My question was about the river graph modeling method that you're using. Is it a machine learning as well, or it's more physical based? Thanks.
Yeah, for the routing mechanism we're using, it is kind of enveloped into the machine learning model. We're rather penalizing the model in the loss equation based on the travel time differences in the model. So, yeah, it's kind of enveloped into that machine learning component.
Yeah, thanks.
We do use the elevation profiles as well, though. So the subbasins kind of divided based on the elevation profiles. If there's a confluence or a gauge, is kind of how we decide where the subbasins should be to feed into that routing component.
Well, we have Jackson up next.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for your time. I was wondering if you noticed if the models performed differently, or any variations in their performance according to seasons. Perhaps in winter they did better, or fall, or like in spring runoffs and certain events, if you notice if they underestimated or overestimated.
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head for the lumped model. I would say for our applications that we're working with, kind of the way we've set up with the operator specific applications right now, most people are primarily concerned about high flow scenarios. And so when you're setting up a machine learning model, you can kind of optimize for high flows and spring runoff. If you had low flow criteria, you could maybe optimize a little bit for the lower flow periods. I'd say in California, most of the models kind of lean towards optimizing towards spring runoff, towards atmospheric river, kind of those high flow events, but that is not something that is like a de facto outcome of this methodology. Kind of more an application around what people are primarily optimizing for in their operations.
Okay, thank you.
Mitch, do you want to come off mute?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, it sounds like perhaps the answer to my question could have been within that last one, but what I have in the chat is that I assume that this model must vary its base assumptions when hydrologic inputs indicate a water year statistical extreme. And will the model filter historical inputs in these cases, or does it just fit the observations? And I think probably a better way of phrasing that would be, you noted in your presentation that this model performed pretty well, or better than others in drought and flood scenarios compared to other models. And I was curious if you could explain perhaps what mechanisms are behind that.
Yeah, I'll do my best. So we're not necessarily looking at extreme water years for a particular watershed. The way that the model is able to predict in those extreme ranges is because of the data that it's exposed to in the kind of base training period. So it's seen similar extreme events, maybe in a different area that are not contained in the historical data set of a watershed. And it's taking those relationships and hydrologic kind of drivers from those types of extreme events and then applying them to a specific watershed. So we're not necessarily mapping to an extreme event water year for that specific basin, but rather the model is understanding those extreme dynamics and then kind of transferring that to how it would play out in your specific watershed with your elevations and basin conditions and that sort of thing.
So similar to a straight statistical model then?
Yeah, I would say depending on how the physical model is trained and what data you're feeding into it.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more, and I'm just going to go in the order that we got another one in the chat. Mark, do you want to come off mute, or do you want me to read your question? Mark?
Yeah, sure. I was just curious, how far out is your forecast horizon and what limits it?
Yeah, so we have a 10-day horizon that goes with an hourly time step. That's really primarily driven by the accuracy of short-term high-resolution weather models. And then we have a seasonal forecast with a daily time step, so a little bit less granularity that can go out 90 days. 90 days probably recommended for non-snow dominated regions. We can extend that to 365 days in snow dominated regions because of the memory retention in the model. And just those snow dynamics tend to kind of extend longer into the season. And we do see improved accuracy over using like a long-term average or LTA for kind of models in snow dominated regions above and beyond that 90 days. Once you get, out 9 months to a year, it tends to converge back to the long-term average just because the limitation there is really on near-term weather model accuracy. Our seasonal models will pull in the GEF's 35-day meteorological forecast and then kind of blend that in with analogous historical years from the AR5 land data set. And so that's how we're kind of extending the model accuracy is using the near-term forecast and then using that to orient with similar climatic years in the past. And that tends to kind of lead to improved accuracy above long-term average.
That, that makes that makes sense. Have you ever considered using some of the short-term climate models that go out to say 9 months?
I think we're always considering which models we should be
Yeah.
using, and we're pulling in, Lucy, I saw your comment on generative AI. We're not using those to train the models right now, but we are surfacing some of those generative AI weather models in our dashboard just because people are curious about them. I think in terms of what we use in the actual models, we're also limited by the historical data set for that particular model because we would want to also include that, like train the model and expose the model to training with that model. And so if there is a sufficient look back period or even a reanalysis for a model, and then we can extend that to forward looking predictions. I think that's definitely something we would consider. So if there's any in particular you're excited about, definitely shoot me a note or an email after because we've got a lot of weather wonks on our team that I'm sure they're already closely following, but it'd be good for me to know as well.
Thanks.
Yep.
Awesome. So that is the end of our presentation. Thank you again, Alex and Sonia, for all of the work that you've been doing on this. And thank you to everyone who joined and asked questions. We are going to, again, share this recording in the next couple of weeks, and we'll have a blog post summary. And I realized that I didn't link the survey, so I will send a survey via email shortly. So please fill that out if you have any feedback for us. And thank you again. We'll see you next time. Thank you again, Alex.
Yeah. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.